Question. Recently, the European Commission presented its latest annual report on the state of the energy sector in the European Union. The document summarizes the results of the 5-year tenure of the current European Commissioners. One of the key achievements is presented as the reduction of Russian gas supplies to the EU. According to Estonia's Energy Commissioner Kadri Simson, the EU is no longer under the control of Putin's pipelines. Additionally, Simpson supports the cessation of Russian gas supplies to the EU through Ukraine. How would you comment on these statements? MV Zakharova. We have repeatedly expressed our assessments of the EU's energy policies. It is now openly stated in Brussels that the primary goal of the energy strategy being promoted in the EU is to cut off Russian energy supplies, undermine the potential of Russia's fuel and energy sector, and thus inflict economic damage on our country. Everything else, including the fight against climate change, is used as a smokescreen or a tool to achieve this purely political goal. The new European Commission (EC) report on the State of the Energy Union presented on September 11th only confirms this. According to the EC itself, as of August this year, Russia's share in the EU's gas imports was 18%. It is clear that for those pushing anti-Russian agendas in the EU, this is far too much. Considering that Washington is currently supplying roughly the same amount to the EU, this is indecently high and should cause embarrassment in front of their American masters, who have worked so hard to get the Europeans hooked on their expensive and non-environmentally friendly LNG, thereby creating conditions to shift industrial capacity from an uncompetitive Europe to the United States. In a report presented earlier this month by former European Central Bank head and ex-Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi on the future competitiveness of the European Union, it was noted that in 2023, gas prices in the EU were almost 3.5 times, 345%, higher than in the US, while electricity prices were over 1.5 times, 158% higher. At the same time, last year, the EU spent 390 billion euros on fossil fuel imports, 90% more than the average annual figure between 2017 and 2021. Norway received 50 billion euros and Russia 30 billion euros. The earnings of other exporters, however, are discreetly left out. What could be the reason? Perhaps it's an attempt to hide the profits of the overseas partner and the price of its solidarity with Europe in the quest to eliminate Russian gas? Nevertheless, this does not stop the Russophobes among EU officials and elites in EU member states from continuing to call for further reductions in Russian gas supplies. How Brussels plans to achieve this is generally clear. It will be done by increasing imports from overseas and further reducing gas consumption. The European Commission has already reported a record number of LNG terminal construction and expansion projects launched between 2022 and 2024, which should allow the EU to increase its LNG import capacity by a quarter by the end of this year. The European Commission, however, remains silent on how much all of this is costing European taxpayers and businesses. For the EU, the cost of breaking off energy cooperation with Russia is a well-kept secret, revealing which could end the careers of more than a few European politicians. Meanwhile, the consequences of the forced reduction in gas consumption imposed on member states, affecting both households and businesses, are increasingly grim for the EU, ranging from decreased industrial output to the worsening problem of energy poverty. We have extensively covered the topic of the deindustrialization of the EU. Now let's turn to the issue of energy poverty. According to official EU data, More than 10% of families in member states are unable to properly heat their homes. In Germany, the number of energy-poor households has increased by 5% since 2021, and in France by 6%. In Lithuania and Bulgaria, 1 in 5 people suffers from energy poverty. In Latvia and Estonia, according to official data, I emphasize, almost a quarter of the remaining population in these countries is at risk. As the European Commission's report shows, although not emphasized and mentioned only in fine print, almost all member states have seen a general phenomenon in recent years: a reduction in the share of natural gas in the energy balance in favor of oil and solid fossil fuels, coal, peat, oil shale. This is happening despite all the talk about the need to green the economy, and in the face of the EU's persistent calls for developing countries to abandon climate-harming coal. Among the leaders in this trend is Estonia, represented in the EU by Energy Commissioner Kadri Simpson, known for her dislike of Putin's pipelines and Russian electricity supplies. The share of solid fossil fuels in Estonia's energy balance rose to 62% in 2022. More recent data is not provided by the European Commission. Meanwhile, between 2020 and 2022, the share of renewable energy in Estonia's electricity production fell from 50% to 33%, while the share of oil shale increased from 37% to 57%. Moreover, Estonia meets more than 70% of its gas needs with U.S. LNG. So much for green arithmetic. All of this also relates to the question of the environmental consequences of the EU's anti-Russian policy. After all, the rise in harmful emissions in the EU due to the shift from gas to less environmentally friendly energy sources cannot be blamed on Moscow's schemes. Our oil and coal exports to the EU have long been almost entirely under sanctions.